Right, so continuing from where we left off, let me just turn off this caps lock. There we go. And then my image plane is a bit crunched up in the corner. I'm going to quickly change its settings. I'm going to select the border of the actual image plane and scroll down to the placement positions, and then use my offset along the y-axis and just use a different value. If you hold down Control and you click inside these little bars, these little text or number bars, it's going to give you an interactive slider as well. If you don't hold down Control, it's not going to give you that little slider. Otherwise, if you wanted to have the same access, you could go to your channel box and then change the offset values there, where you click on the name and then middle mouse click and drag in your viewport. You guys remember that? Right, so still a bit too far up. There we go, that's better. So now if we have a look at this, we can see that there's a little bit of a frame at the top of the chimney, and we have a few extra details we want to add. So I think let's start off with the chimney, that being the simplest shape at the moment. I'm going to select the roof. I'm going to hit F to frame on that, and I'm going to change the shape. At the moment it's very rectangular. I'm going to try and squeeze it up to be more, boxy. So the way that I'm going to do this is by selecting the components and then scaling just the faces or the vertices or the lines that I initially want to edit. So if we go right click on the mesh and go to vertex mode, we should now be able to do a drag select over the components that we want to adjust, and then jump to my scale tool. I can then just kind of squeeze these in until I have a nice square looking shape. That's much better. That's more or less what I was kind of going for. Right, so I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that. So now that we have the actual thickness, guys, please watch. Once we have the thickness blocked out and we've got the overall shape that we want, we're going to do a series of extrusions. There's many ways of approaching it. We can extrude up first and then out second, or we can add an insert edge loop and then extrude straight out. There's many different ways, as long as you get the additional detail to kind of represent that profile. So it doesn't really matter how you approach that. If you feel like you want to do the extrusions like one extrude, another extrude, that's completely fine with me, as long as you have more or less the same shape. So I'm going to do an insert edge loop, more or less the thickness of that border, and then I'm going to go to face mode and then loop select that. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with the loop select. And then I'm going to do the extrude and then pull this out to give it that little border. Okay, at the moment this bottom face is not the same depth on either side, so I'm going to select both sides, and I'm not sure exactly why. I think it's because this edge is shorter than this one, so when it did the insert it wasn't going in a perfect straight line. So with those faces selected, I would then go to my scale tool and then scale the green cube to the light blue cube, and that's going to straighten out the line. And then you can just modify the thickness and the adjustment to your liking. And if you want a hole at the top, we'll probably do another extrude with the offset inwards and another extrude and then pull it down. And that's how I would essentially approach that. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some time to quickly do it. So once we have the chimney locked out, what I like to do is kind of analyze whether my model is on track or not. And the way I do that is by pressing 7 on the keyboard. Now this only works if you have no lights in your scene. Currently there's a default light in the scene that's parented permanently to your actual camera. So when you move your camera around, you'll actually see the lights changes from one shade of color to another shade of color when you move around. You can see it looks like it's lighter there and darker there if you look at the roof. So essentially by moving around the scene, that light automatically adjusts the normals to kind of display the model in its best lighting condition for the current setup. So we don't have any physical Maya lights in the scene. So if you look at these guys over here, I haven't created any of those. I don't want to create any of those at this current state because I'm essentially blocking out the design. So this feature essentially turns on all lights in the scene, but since there's no physical lights in the scene, it acts like a silhouette, which is great. So if I press 7, the model goes to like this completely blacked out state, which is great because then I can analyze whether certain shapes are longer or shorter, if this chimney needs to be, you know, maybe higher up, and always check that you don't have the wrong stuff selected. You can see, oh, that's obviously off. Getting the camera angle more or less where you want, bring it down, and round about there should be a good place more or less for that chimney. If we look at the border edges over here, we can't really make out the sides, so I'll probably grab these guys, go at that same angle, go to my scale tool, and then pull these guys out until they represent more of the same kind of profile as I have there. So you're essentially analyzing without looking at the final detail or the initial detail in the mesh. It's a really nice way to kind of, you know, constantly reevaluate the model instead of just designing and only later on realize, oh, I've added all these details and now it's going to be very dense and very difficult for me to kind of quickly adjust, you know, smaller shapes and so on. So this is something very valuable to kind of take in consideration. If you want to go out of it again, just press 5. That goes back to your regular shaded view, and that puts you back into your regular, you know, shaded model. From here, we can then, you know, start doing all your adjustments, all your modeling tweaks and so on. So I want you guys to go through that process, tweak your height of your actual chimney, the roof, and all those things. So going from here, I'm now going to focus on getting this little window at the top. Now, to have a look at this window, we can see that that's more or less exactly in the center of the little house from the side profile. So for me to get that kind of placed more or less around about there, it's going to essentially going a bit of a, I don't know how to explain it. Like we have to create one half and apply it to the other half, or we can you know, do some sort of a double extrusion of two faces and then kind of scale them so that they're more square, because at the moment the roof is going at a diagonal angle, and then if we had to go and extrude that, that will essentially break the profile, so it's going to keep its little window frame structured like that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a few tweaks that we have to do additionally. So the way I would approach this is to select the two faces, and you can definitely see just by counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got 4 edges or vertices on either sides, but if we had to go and extrude this in, we'll end up with a lot more points, so just be aware of that. If you don't want that, we'll have to kind of tweak them afterwards. So I'm going to do a quick extrude. I'm going to do an offset inwards, and at this point you can see if I keep pushing the offset too far, then the bottom edge will start overlapping itself, which is not good. Okay, so what we need to do is then at this point manually start adjusting these vertices. So I'm going to select these points, make sure you don't select anything at the back, which I am. It's always going to happen. Then I'm going to pull these guys in and up, and this one down, and then grab these points and then scale them flat to kind of create that shape. Huh? Yeah, try. So remember, I'm just selecting points and I'm using the scale tool to flatten them. So should I run through that again? Okay, I'll quickly do that again. Okay, so just before we did the extrude, so have the faces selected, 1, 2, extrude, a bit of offset, and then I would then go and manually grab these outer 2 points, scale them in to get more or less the width of the actual frame. These bottom edges should, for the most part, already be pretty straight, so I'm going to just drag that cube to the center, and then these top 3, scale them flat. Okay. Right, so from here, once we have that flat plane at the top and the bottom, we can then, just select the inside faces. That's essentially representing the actual framework for the window. And mine, it actually looks a little bit too wide. If you look at the gap in between there, even this is too far out. But it's fine for now. I'm just going to manually kind of squeeze these in, more or less there. And it's definitely too long as well. More like that would be a good place. So once I've done those small adjustments, I'll then do another extrude, and I'll just kind of squeeze or push the actual faces in to kind of create the actual framework for the window. This is now a good place for me to start actually selecting the inner faces for the framework to create the actual window, the wooden frames as we have in the reference image. So quickly do those adjustments, and then we can get into the frames. So continuing with a little video, if we have a look at just frame of this thing, get a bit closer, we have currently just the framework of where the windows would fit in, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to do it on the first one, and then you guys need to essentially replicate the same thing of the windows, of the door, so pretty much all the little extrusions that we have on this mesh. So do you guys remember when we did the roof, we selected the faces at the top and then we did duplicate faces, and that just kind of pushed that off. So we're using the same kind of technique. So I'm going to run to the face, on the right click face mode, do a loop select for those. You can see that goes all the way around, and then I would go to the edit mesh, and then at the bottom there's a duplicate face. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to use the offset, and that will offset it inwards. Now if you do that too much, you're going to end up with just a flat piece of nothing. So be careful. So you might also want to use the local Z, or there's just the blue line, and that will offset it inwards. You see, if you keep doing that, I'm going to do this kind of weird thing. So unfortunately, because each face has their own independent edge connections, when you're doing an offset, they will all pinch in at the same, or at all the edges, and sometimes the shape kind of collapses, so you still have to go and kind of straighten out some of them. So I'm going to get more or less where I want it to be, the thickness of the frame, and then what I want to do is straighten out these edges at the bottom, or just the vertices for that matter. So this is something that we haven't talked about. I would like to now essentially talk about the actual snapping tools. So we have snapping for vertex, we have snapping for faces, and we have snapping for edges. Okay, edges slash curves, if you will. Then we also have a grid kind of snapping function, so it actually snaps to the grid points. Very, very useful. And then we can additionally, on top of that, which we will not talk about in this course, is snap to an actual surface. So how this works is I'm going to have the components selected that I essentially want to snap, like these two vertices. And then since we have the move tool, we can essentially move in any direction, whether it's the y-axis, the z-axis, or the x-axis. So what I want to do is I want to find an exact perfect straight line going across there, instead of using the all technique where you select all the vertices and then scale it down flat. That's a completely valid way of doing it, but I want to show you guys a new tool, a new set of techniques. So this takes a bit of a process to kind of get used to. Essentially, if you look at these little magnets at the top of the screen, we have a grid snap, we have curve snap, we have point snap, and then they've implemented snapping based on a projected curve, and then we have a view plane snapping, and then lastly we have the object kind of snap. So what we want to do is talk about the first three and also the hotkeys associated to those. So when you toggle these buttons on, they essentially stay on the whole time. I personally don't like to work this way. I would like to have the ability to turn it on demand. I don't want to have it on at all time, because I'm gonna get myself into a place where I forget about it, and then suddenly I can't figure out why this thing keeps snapping every time. So for me to work around this, instead of toggling it on and leaving it on like that, I would leave it off and then use the keyboard hotkeys. So while the button on the keyboard is held down, it's essentially staying in that snapping mode. As soon as I let go of the button, it actually toggles off that feature. So the three hotkeys for the first three snapping methods. The first one is X for grid snap. The second one is C for curve snap. And then the third one is V for vertex, or rather point snap. Everyone got that? Right. So in this case, I want to use vertex snap. So how I'm going to go about it is I'm going to select my components that I would like to snap to something. I'm going to hold down my V button, and you can see now the button is highlighted. As soon as I let go, it toggles off. Right. So by holding it down, it stays in that snapping state for that particular type of snapping mode, and then as soon as I let go, it toggles off. You can also notice that the actual manipulator goes from a square in the center to a circle in the middle. So that's also a nice way to kind of, realize, oh, I'm in snapping mode. So while I'm holding the V button, I'm going to click on my directionality that I want to essentially snap. So in this case, I want to essentially line these points to the ones at the bottom. Now I don't want to move it to there. I want to keep it offset exactly where it is now, but I just want to move it straight down. So that's why I'm going to click on my y-axis arrow and then drag. You can see it immediately snapped to this wrong surface because it found the closest vertex point to where my mouse cursor is. And then while I'm dragging, I'm going to move my mouse to the closest component that I want to use as a sample for where it should snap. And then as soon as I move over the vertex, it's going to essentially snap. Okay. Once I do that, I'm going to let go of my mouse first, and then let go of my point snapping. That's essentially the process. So I'm going to run through that again. I'm going to hold down V. I'm going to click and drag my mouse to where I want. Then I'm going to let go of my mouse. Then I'm going to let go of my snapping button. Okay. So please try that for me. So once I have these lined up nice and straight, we can then start thinking about maybe giving this actual thickness. So the window frame itself seems to appear more towards the edge on the outside than it does to the inside. And if you think about it in real life also, you have the window frame on the actual glass pane in the frame of the glass closest to the outside, and a little bit of the framework on the inside. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this outer edge, and I'm not too concerned to match them 100%. You're not designing for an architect. You're just designing to get the actual model out. So I'm going to grab the outer edges. So I'm going to go to my wireframe by pressing 4. And then I'm going to go to the side view just by manually rotating my camera. And then do a quick drag select over those points. And then back to my shaded view by pressing 5. And then pulling these out. Just enough to actually get some sort of thickness around the frame. And at the back, I'm going to do the same kind of thing, selecting the border edges and then pull them in a bit like that. So that's where the frame will essentially occur. So once I have these and it's nice and straight, I'm going to select all the faces for that particular frame, then give it an extrude and then pull the extrude backwards. Now again, it rounds out. I don't want that unless I want to go and tweak it afterwards. So the nice thing is the extrude, instead of using the local Z being the little arrow or this value over here, we could use the offset, and that's going to try and maintain the frame from all angles to stay consistent. Unfortunately, the duplicate face does not have that functionality to keep the thickness attributes passing through there. So once I have that, you will now see we've got a thickened up frame. The only problem is that it's reversed. So the thing with extrusion, when you extrude one direction in a positive direction, essentially in the direction of the arrow, then it's going to come out the way it's supposed to look, being the shading side outwards. If it turns out black, like we see here, that means the faces are now pointing inwards. So if I go all the way inside the mesh, can you guys see that the shaded part is on the inside of that frame and not on the outside? So the reason why this is occurring is because of reversed normals. Now, to explain this process a little bit more clearly, I'm going to quickly draw out some sort of a diagram kind of thing in Photoshop. Just give me a few seconds. I'll create a new document, and okay, here we go. Right. So let's say this is a polygon face. Something like that. And that's our little dot that we usually have in the center of the mesh. So the one side that we usually look at is going to be the shaded side. Okay, so that's the part that I'm essentially just kind of quickly blocking out with a line. And then if you think about it in terms of its directionality, if the camera was on this side, so that's my little camera looking at this guy, and so normals pointing towards the camera is essentially showing the shaded side. Normals pointing away from the camera being, let's quickly swap this to a different color like blue, going that way, that's the back side. Okay, so, and this is the front being red. Okay, so how do we switch the faces so that the normals are now not pointing inwards but rather outwards towards the camera, the side that we are essentially looking at? So there's a function in Maya called reverse normals. Okay, and the word normals essentially refer to the thing that links itself to the camera to show which side is front and which side is back. So normal is the thing that we need to essentially adjust. So going back to Maya, we can see that essentially the back side is showing up black and the front side is showing up shaded towards us. So I'm going to have the whole model selected in object mode. I'm going to go to mesh display, so it's a mesh display function. We're going to go there, and then we're going to click on the reverse button, and that will reverse the normals to point now in the right direction. Okay, so that's essentially what I'm doing here. I just took those faces, moved them out, give it a bit of thickness, and since I extruded backwards instead of forwards, that's why it reversed the normals, and then we have to manually go and flip them using the mesh display reverse. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that. Right. So taking it from where it's currently at, I'm going to select the border frame of the actual door and give that thickness. So I'm just going to select the side faces and not the bottom, because obviously we don't want to have that as something that you will trip over, fall over. So I'm going to have that selected, and we're going to, I use the marking menu, so I'm holding down, oops, holding down shift and then right clicking. That gives me the same kind of the tool sets as if you were to go to the edit mesh. So it's kind of like a short list of most commonly used tools. So whichever component type you have selected, this marking menu will automatically give you the tool specifically for that. So that's a very nice way of just enhancing your workflow and speed to get to all those tools. So I'm going to do the extrude faces. Actually no, I don't want to do an extrude face, I want to do a duplicate face. So it's the same thing as going to edit mesh and then duplicate. So then I'm going to pull those guys in, and once again you will notice that this will collapse inwards. You just have to kind of manually tweak them. So I'm going to get it to more or less where it's supposed to be, and then grab this top two faces. I'm going to scale them together, or use that point snap technique. And even that profile right there is skew. So sometimes, you know, when you have a lot of components, they tend to skew out with a duplicate face. And just keep that in mind for when you're doing these things. So once I have that, I'm going to select that one mesh, apply an extrude to it, and then offset that inwards this way using thickness to maintain that borders as a consistent profile. So once I've done that, I'm going to go back to object mode, have that selected. You can see my pivot is way off in the distance. It's right in the center of the grid, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to go to modify and then center the pivot, and that will line it, and it's not going to allow me to do that. Oh, there we go. I think I had two things selected. Right, so always make sure you have that object selected before you hit the modify center pivot. That's going to place it where it's supposed to be, and I'm going to pull out a little bit to kind of break that frame, and then again go through that process of reversing the normals. So that's a simple process. Instead of having the full frame, you only have certain faces selected. So this shouldn't be too complex in terms of setup, other than pretty much the same workflow as what we did over here at the top. So for the door itself, this door requires a few divisions going along the center. In fact, let me open up the reference image on the side. I'm going to zoom in and show you guys what I'm referring to. So we've got the door, then we've got the insets, and we've got this little cross happening through the center. So we essentially need to find a way to simplify the process of getting these shapes out as quick as possible. So what do you guys think in terms of actual setting up as base model? How would we go about making this easier for ourselves? Yes? Mm-hmm. You're right. Pieces. Ah, right. Okay, that's a good way. So essentially, you're creating the cross using the multi-cut. So you're dividing through the center in both axes, and then you can select the faces on either sides of the cross, and then extrude them using an offset to pull in. Is that what you're saying? Right. So that's exactly what I would do. I would go one step further by giving it a bevel to make that profile of the actual frame just a little bit thicker, and then I would do the extrude inwards to kind of get my little panels on the inside. So let's quickly see if we can do that. So why not use existing geometry, right? So instead of me creating a new plane to trying to fit it exactly in the position of the door, I might as well grab the same faces that we have here, have those guys selected, go through the same process of duplicating the faces, and then I'm going to pull straight out. I'm going to deselect that, modify center pivot, and then pull that out. Now if you look at this, the door is bigger than the frame. Can you guys see that? So I need to shrink this down a bit. So I'm going to go to my side view, and it's very difficult to see in this view. I'm going to right click and say vertex mode, and then I'm going to click and drag over those points and bring them in just enough on all sides. I use my scale tool and then pull that in until I have at least more or less the same width from either sides of this door. So that's more or less what I was kind of hoping for. Back to my perspective view, you can now see if I were to move this in and out, it's not cutting through that actual framework. So I'm adjusting the position of the original vertices just a little bit inwards because the frame is kind of catching on the sides. So once I have that, I would then go and use my multi-cut over here. I'm trying to cut that right through the center, and then I'm going to select this edge, or at least all the corner edges going through there, and then I'm going to bevel that using a fraction and then pull that frame inwards to more or less the thickness that I want. Then you have all the faces already prepared for you, so you don't need to use that. Sorry, let me reselect that again. Instead of using that offset or that keep faces together, you already have those lined out. Now if we look very closely to the image, you'll notice that it has a top border and a side border as well. So I would go one step further and prepare that as well. I would do a multi-cut at the top, multi-cut at the bottom, and then the sides. Now I'm doing this off by eye. If you want to be more precise, you know, you can absolutely do that. And then I would grab these guys, selecting them, and then extrude with an offset, push them in, extrude again, offset, and then pull out. And there you have your detailed frame. Oops, that's a bit too much. Like that. And that's how I would approach it. Okay, I'm going to undo and quickly run through that again, just to be very clear with how I got to that. That's my initial plane. You could select the cross points, loop select them, do a bevel, use my fraction, do a multi-cut at the top, multi-cut at the bottom and the two sides. And then I'm going to go and select the inner faces, extrude, offset, pull in. Bit too much, there we go. You could leave it like that if you want to, or you can add one extra extrude with another offset and then pull out, and that should be good enough for the most part. That's how you build the frame. Okay, so there's our little door and the framework that we have essentially extracted from the same geometry. It's a lot easier to use existing geometry than trying to go back and, you know, create a new box or new plane, match it exactly with to the dimensions of the window or the door frame, and then take it from there. So always try and reuse existing geometry. If you have it, why not use it? And if it's too much polygon kind of or edge loops running across the edges, get rid of the unnecessary edges, and then, you know, start doing your extrudes and your bevels and your offsets. Okay, I'm going to give you guys some time to do that. Right, so roof tiles. So the next thing is essentially duplicate instance, and I'm going to quickly talk about the different types of duplicates. So the first one is, I think, something that we essentially have talked about, and that's duplicate faces. Okay, so that's, you know, taking a face from a model and then generating a brand new one from that selection, and then we have a copy of it that's been moved off along a certain axis. Now what if we want to generate a full object, right, and make a brand new, that's the most perfect box ever. Perspective gone to waste. Right, so we have a duplicate object. Let's do this, there we go. So if we want to make another copy of this one where it's exactly the same shape, but the shape itself should not have any relationship to one another, it's just a shape duplicate, then we have to then we can use the regular duplicate function, and the hotkeys associated to this is going to be Control CTRL plus D. That's duplicating a selection, in this case an actual object. So using Control D, we can make a copy that's right on top of the original one, okay? And then we we actually grab the manipulator handle, that being the Y and X and Z, and we move that around until we have one moved off from the other. So essentially, when it duplicates, it places that duplicate right on top of the original. So you want to move it off from that particular shape. And then finally, the other duplicate is going to be the duplicate special. Right. So how that works is a duplicate special gives us like a window with multiple properties or attributes that we can go and change, and then we can change how the relationship or connection between these are associated to each other. So there's a type of duplicate called duplicate instance. Okay. Instance is a copy of the original, so orig and then instance. And the cool thing is, if I manipulate the first one, if I, whichever components, whether it's face mode or vertex or edge, any component type, if we change these guys, that passes through to that one automatically, which is awesome. Great for if you want to start off with a simplified shape and really detail a lot of objects very quickly. Okay, in this case we can do it to the roof tiles and essentially replicate that kind of effect. So there's different ways of working. You have the option to choose whatever you want to work with. Okay, so is this clear? Everyone happy in terms of the basic understanding and theory of it? So let's see how that works inside of Maya. So I'm going to start off with a simplified box just to explain the concept, and then we can get into the more nitty-gritty details. So there's my box. So if I hit Control D, that makes a copy right on top of the original. Now, for beginners, you typically end up hitting Control D multiple times without realizing it, because you're not seeing the object moving. Okay, then they end up having stacks and stacks in the attributes or the outliner. So if I hit Control D a few times, they're right on top of each other and they're not moving. So I've seen this happening where there's 200 duplicates and the guy didn't even realize it. So just be careful. So that's why I'm very adamant in explaining this ahead of time. So when you're doing the duplicate, Control D, then you have to go to the move tool and move that copy off. And this regular Control D duplicate method is very quick, and it allows you to place multiple objects very quickly. Like if you have a pre-made asset like a table or a chair and you want to have multiple chairs that's already kind of laid out and you're not going to do any edits to them, this is a great way of approaching it. But let's say I want to duplicate this guy and I want to duplicate it the next one with the exact same offset between the first and the second. Okay, the cool thing about this is, let me go back to my quick little demo explanation thing here. I'm going to wipe this stuff out here. So there's a Control D as a regular duplicate, and then we have something called the duplicate with offset. So just write down in brackets dupe with offset. So this is slightly different, but they essentially use the same kind of method. It's still a separate copy that has no relationship to the first. So the hotkey for that is going to be Shift plus D. Okay, you have to do the first one with Control D, move the object, and then you can hit Shift D, and that will replicate the distance offset between the first and the second. So watch. I'm going to grab my first one, hit Control D, move it off, and immediately you cannot click on anything else or deselect the object, otherwise this won't work. It's going to essentially store the information into clipboard until I click on something else. As soon as I click on something else, it essentially clears out the clipboard, essentially removing that offset information from the first to the second. And then I'm going to hit Shift D, and you can keep repeating that process which is great. Now, if you want to do something in a circular kind of way, that essentially applies to kind of same thing. Let's say I have this guy over here, but its pivot is maybe in the center of, let's say you want to do some sort of a, circular pillar structure of sorts, and my offset is over there. If I hit Control D and I rotate that around that pivot, and I hit Shift D, it's going to repeat that same rotations along that profile. So it's very nice to kind of create these radial patterns, and it essentially stores information for scale and rotate and translate. So I could go as far as saying this should be like a staircase kind of thing. So I duplicate my first one, Control D, rotate that, and move it up at the same time. So now I've got two different transforms happening. So when I hit the Shift D, it's essentially replicating that same thing, but in a radial upwards pattern. So there's that kind of thing that you can make use of as well. Right, is there any questions regarding this? It's simple, it's Control D, move it, Shift D, and it repeats that same offset change that you've done. I'm going to create a box. You could actually start off with whatever you feel like. It doesn't necessarily have to be a box. I'm going to keep it very simple in terms of physical geometry. I could go and obviously model out the exact profile of a roof tile, but for this case I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. So I'm going to make my box. I'm going to move my box more or less into position, frame it, just very, very small, move that closer, use my scale tool, maybe a little bit thicker, and then I'm going to rotate that into position. And for this I'm going to place it all the way at the bottom. So you guys notice that my manipulator handle is pointing the direction of my object rotation. So that's because my transform orientation axis is set to object. If this was set to world, then this will go straight up and down. So in this case I do want to use object space because it really helps you, keep things nice and perfectly aligned to your object. So I'm going to move that more or less into position like that, and let's see, Control D, move it up and over to about there. I'm going to hit Shift D and I'm going to repeat that, and then hopefully that will maintain its offset if we've done it perfect. Yay, look at that. Okay, and then from there I would select all those, Control D, move those across, and there you go. And that's how you would detail something with multiple repetitions. Yo, that's almost perfect. Control D, move it off manually. Control D again. Shift D. Okay. And then lastly, you can select only the ones that kind of make sense to that little bit over there. Maybe one less. Control D. Shift D. Shift D. And then we have most of the roof tiles kind of blocked out. Okay. I want you guys to give this a try for me, please. So we talked about the basic duplicate function. So edit, duplicate, Control D. Now I'm going to talk about the duplicate special. And I think we also talked about the duplicate with transform or with offset. Okay. So we're going to talk about this duplicate special now. And this is the function that essentially allows us to create some sort of instancing of sorts. So let's say I have some, like little pot plants or something along the side of my little house. I'm going to create a basic cylinder. Move that cylinder more or less into position. I'm going to scale it up. Using my T key, I can bring up my heads-up display to quickly change my transform settings. I don't need this window. Collapse that. Make this a little bit smaller. There we go. Much better. And I'm going to bring this guy down. Move this across. Frame that. Right. So that definitely does not look like a pot or any of that. So I'm quickly going to add a few extra divisions along the width of my geometry. So if we go back to the channel box and click on polysurface or polycylinder, again that little window pops up, and then we can increase or decrease the height divisions. And I don't want to overly subdivide this. I want it just enough for me to control that. And along the axes, I'm going to reduce that to about 8. It keeps it a lot more simpler in terms of manipulating the basic shape. Let's drop this down even to like maybe 3, or let's keep it like 5 is good enough. Right, and then from here I want to, let's say, have 3 or 4 pots all the way around this little front line of the house. So instead of regular Control D, I would then go and make an instance of that. So duplicate, special, and then I'm going to click on the little option box. And then in here we have options. Let me quickly go to edit reset settings so you guys can see the default settings. The default is set geometry type as copy, so it acts exactly like the regular Control D. So if you want to have this as an instance so that when we change the first one it changes all the others, you have to switch that. And then there's some transform informations where you can actually like offset this one already with a certain X value or Y value or Z value. Same thing goes to scale, and you can type in how many repeats you want. Like if I want to have this guy offset, and let's give it 2 units for centimeters, and obviously that needs to be along the Z axis, not the X axis, so we need to change that to 0 and 2 instead. So this is X, this is Y, and this is Z. It's always in that order, so you shouldn't get confused in terms of which one comes first. It's always X, Y, Z. Then I'm going to type in 3, so the first one plus additional 3 to make 4. I'm going to hit apply, and you're going to see it offsets 2 units off of each other. That's obviously too little, so I'm going to undo and type in like -8, or just 8, sorry, and then same thing, 3, and now they're offset a little bit further. Let's try maybe 15. Okay, that's better. So now I can close this window, and if I change any of them, doesn't matter if it's the first one or the last one or any of the in-betweens, they're all instances of one another. So I can now go in, select the components, and you can see all the components on all the others are now being selected. So if I select just that piece over there, I can then go and scale that out and then start tweaking the shape of the pot overall to be the design that I kind of hoping for. You can also manually move these guys, so that is the only time where they're not moving along. It's only when you change the actual components where they start changing their dimensions and shapes. So you can randomly start like stacking these guys in object mode, wherever you want. You can even scale this one as an overall object bigger, and then these ones keep them nice and small. I have that one around the corner, maybe over there, and they're all floating. So we need to, this one will change afterwards, move them down more or less, and this one is a little bit too low. That should be good. Right, so now if I go back to vertex or any of that, you can see they're all having those components selected. So you have those selected, and you can do pretty much any edits: extrudes, insert edge loops, bevels, bridges, whatever, anything. They will all have the same effect being applied to all of them, which is excellent. Like that, for instance, if I use the modeling toolkit with a multi-cut in between there, and there, and then grab these points. You'll see they're being added as well on all those. So it's not breaking the mesh at all. It keeps them all consistent without needing to remodel 3 or 4 different variations, or tweaking one at a time, if you will. I'm just fooling around now. Yeah, so there's little pot thingies, and then if you're happy and you don't want them to be instances anymore, you would want them to select all of these, and then finally go to modify, and you want to convert the instance to an object, and that will disconnect the actual relationship between them and bake them in their current state. So now if I change one, the other one will not be affected. Like if I go here and grab some points, you can see that these are not being selected. So if I do this kind of adjustment, it only applies it to that particular object that's now not an instance anymore. Okay, you can only have one selected, and then do a modify, convert instance to object, and then only that one will be taken out of the equation in terms of the instancing. But if you do it to all of them, they're essentially completely independent of each other. Right, so that's the last little thing that I wanted to show you guys in terms of that. So if you want to do some sort of shelving or like repetitive type of stuff that really needs a lot of adjustment and modeling, and I use this technique when I'm creating tileable textures. I would actually create some sort of a manual weave pattern. I would physically model it out and then create that overlapping on a perfect grid. So when they're all instances, I can tweak one and the other one is being affected, so I can always make sure that they're crossing over one another, and so on. And then when I have the perfect tile, I would generate a texture from that and then use that texture over and over for other things. So that's different situations where you might want to use it. Cool. Okay, that's it for now today. The next lesson we're going to start focusing on textures, so yay.